Hello there, everybody, and welcome back. We are restarting the Jacksonville Chess for Charity Game of the Week series. Very excited to be bringing you some highlights from some classical chess that has been coming out of the Jacksonville area now. So if you're looking for some classical chess to play, you're out in Florida, out around Jacksonville, check out Monday nights right now. And that's the Chess for Charity Jacksonville Club website details you can see on the banner there. Make sure to look them up. If you're looking for a longer game, we got Game 65 Delay 5 action coming your way. And those submissions, you can send them out to me too. You got any good games? I'll take a look at them, and we'll find some exciting games and great chess to bring your guys' way. So, without further ado, let's dive straight in, look at the first game of the week from this fall classical series. So the game that I've picked this week is featuring Austin Reheiser with the white pieces taking on Rushil Rajagopal with the black ones. Hopefully I'm not butchering anybody's name too bad. Feel free to give me a shout if I am. I do my best. But this game, I really liked it. The reason I picked it was it shows some very clear plans from both players, what go on here, and I think it's a very instructive game and a very well-played game from both sides, but especially from the side that ended up winning. So let's see just what happened in this game and get into the action without any further ado. So we started off with an English opening. Austin opened up with c4, and black responded in the center with e5. g3, knight to c6, knight to c3, knight f6, bishop to g3. So far, everything is standard, sort of English opening, and this is really where maybe we start to get a little bit out of book here on move 4. Black decides to go with the move d6. Now, d6, of course, isn't a bad move in any sense of the word necessarily. It's solid. You've got this strong pawn chain here in the center. However, you're blocking your bishop out, right? This bishop on f8 is not going to be able to go anywhere other than to the e7 square, and a lot of times this bishop is more comfortable either being on c5 or on b4, where it eyes some of the white targets in the white's camp. So d6 may be a small inaccuracy already, and we're going to kind of start to see in this game. White gets a clear setup in mind that white ends up playing for, and black, while developing the pieces, maybe doesn't have such clear plans. So let's see how this unfolds in the next few moves. d3, bishop to e6, and once again this move bishop to e6, maybe not the best square for the bishop, because, well, if you want to play d5, it could help with that, but unless you're going to play d5 on the next turn, this move doesn't do a whole lot other than bring a piece out, where it's not necessarily doing very much. And after white's move e4, d5 is not going to be an option anyway. White has secured that square in their own camp and said, nah, you're not going to be pushing anytime soon. So at this point already you can see black is a little bit more cramped, and white is enjoying a space advantage due to the structure he has with pawns on c4, d3, and e4, and some more natural looking development for the time being. Of course, this bishop is also blocked by the e4 pawn, so that's something to evaluate as well. Not that black is necessarily any worse off at this point. Bishop to e7, knight g to e2, both sides castle, and now we start to get to the next phase of the game. We're moving out of the opening into this middle game, and we got to ask ourselves, what are the plans for both sides? Well, this style of development, this is known as the Botvinnik setup for white. So for those of you who have not seen this before, with the fianchettoed bishop over here on g2 on the diagonal, the pawn structure of c4, d3, and e4, and the knights on c3 and e2, this is a Botvinnik setup. And 90% of the time in this sort of structure, white has a very clear plan, and well, can any of you guess what that is? Well, it has to do with the fact that we developed this knight to e2 instead of to f3. Of course, on e2, nothing is in the way of the f pawn, and this pawn can start pushing up the board. I would say more often than not, this is going to be white's goal. White is going to try to achieve this f-pawn break. Now, it's also possible white could play moves like rook b1, b4, b5. White could try to play on the queen side as well, but generally speaking, this f-pawn break is going to be white's plan. He's got control of d5, and he wants his pieces to start flowing toward the king side, where hopefully they can launch an attack on the king. However, let's sort of look at what's going on with black in this position. Black has a flexible setup, a solid setup, but it's not so obvious what black's next course of action should be. He could try to play on the queen side as well, maybe moves like a5 or a6 and b5, rook b8. Try to get some counterplay going on the queen side could be one plan of action. Black could also consider moving their own knight away, playing the knight to e8 or d7, and then pushing f5. Maybe this would be one way to meet the move f4. However, the problem with this is, let's say we do play a move like knight d7, and after something like f4, f5, we mentioned before that this e4 pawn sort of keeps white's g2 bishop caged in, so after white takes, suddenly white's bishop comes to life on this long diagonal and becomes a very nice piece. So even though black gets some activity on the king side to try to match what's going on with white, white's pieces start coming to life very easily, and I'm not so sold that this is the best plan of action for black. So what happened in our game here? We've got to kind of look at all of these different things and see which way our players chose. Rushil chose to go with the move a6, and this is preparing to launch some counterplay on the queen side. Well, what is white going to play here? You guessed it, we already mentioned it. f4, white's main plan in the position, and perhaps this move is maybe a little bit premature. Black does have the option of playing a move like bishop to g4 here, and this could be a little bit annoying with the pin on the e2 knight. However, in the game, we did not see bishop g4. Instead, black chose to continue with their own plan, and that was to play rook b8. Again, an odd move if we're not thinking about the plans that we're trying to go for, but if we understand that black wants to play the move b5, wants counterplay on the queen side, it's a very logical move to make in that sense. However, there are some big drawbacks to it, and not least of all, is that white can play f5. And now we get this closed center, this lock structure, and look at white's pawns. He's got this beautiful V pawn chain, the V for victory. White trying to march their way up the board here to a win. And a lot of the time in these sort of structures, black has to be very, very careful. And the reason is, even though at the moment there's no material imbalance, white has more space on the king side, and white is going to more easily be able to bring pieces toward black's king to attack. For example, this dark square bishop is already posed to come to any square on this diagonal at any point in time. The knight is getting ready to jump to d5. Both white's g and h pawn could push up the board at any moment. Either one of these could start coming. They could kick the knight. And as those things happen, maybe the other knight can come to g3, h5. The rook might get an open f-file. Everything is ready to move toward the king. Now, a lot of times, the way that black meets these sort of positions is by doing what black was doing in the game, playing on the queen side, trying to generate counterplay. However, the downside to this, of course, is if you're the side playing on the queen side, if your opponent makes a mistake, maybe you'll be able to get an advantage, something you can use in the long term to convert to a win. But the side that's attacking on the king side, well, if black makes a mistake, it's just going to lead to checkmate and then game over. So I always like to be the side attacking the king if I can help it. But once again, that's a very double-edged kind of position. So here, after the move bishop d7, white decided to take a move to slow down black's plans. Again, we talked about black wanting to play b5. a4 is a prophylactic move, just shutting that down before going forward with moves on the king side. Of course, there is a drawback here. This b4 square becomes a little bit weak, and black could consider a move like knight b4 here. Now, this next move, unfortunately, is probably the big mistake of the game, and black plays the move g6. And at first glance, this may not look so bad. It may look like, yes, black is challenging the f-pawn, trying to maybe open things up. If white trades off, the rooks can face each other off on the f-file, and maybe black can unwind. But there's a couple things to remember in these sort of positions, and one of the big ones is when your opponent is pawn storming toward your king, shoving these pawns your way, very rarely do you ever want to push the pawn protection in front of your own king. As soon as you do that, your opponent is going to start to get way more holes, way more squares, and way more ways of creating their attack. And let's see how Austin chooses to go about that. Well, of course, there could be the option to take the pawn, but this really isn't so scary. In fact, this is kind of what black wants. After a move like f takes and f takes, black's rook will be able to get into the game, and black can probably defend this without too much trouble. There should be some chances here still for him. However, g6 not only created tension on the f-pawn, but it also created some holes, and one of those holes is, of course, h6. So Austin plays the move bishop to h6, diving in, attacking the f8 rook, and suddenly black's cramped position is starting to show how it has some cracks in it. Already, look at all of these pieces and how few squares they have to go to. The rook, only one place to run away to. It has to go to e8. And look, if black wants to move their bishop, it only has one square it can move to. If black wants to move the rook, only one square it can move to. If black wants to move this bishop, one square it can move to. If black wants to move the queen, one square it can move to. 4 pieces that only have one square. This rook only has 2, and the knights aren't doing that much better. The knight on f6 has 2 as well. The knight on c6, this one has a few more. That's black's most mobile piece, and unfortunately, it's the piece furthest away from the defense. So this cramped position is not doing black any favors, and how will white continue to dive in with the attack? Well, there's a few different good moves here. I won't go into all of the different lines and all the different crazy things that can happen. Let's look at what goes on in the game. Bishop to h3. I really like this move. It's a very principled move. We talked earlier how the bishop wasn't doing much. It was biting on its own pawn on e4. Now that the bishop comes to h3, it's participating in the attack, helping support the f5 pawn and putting pressure on this diagonal if white eventually takes and creates some tactical shots. So a nice little move there, bishop h3. Black plays bishop to f8, again the only square that bishop could even go to, trying to trade off these pieces. Now, here's a good question. If we're white, do we want to trade off the bishops? Well, yes and no, right? Of course, black has some dark squared weaknesses. So if we get rid of black's dark square bishop, it's going to be very hard for black to defend the dark squares in his camp. However, we don't really want to make the trade on f8. We kicked that rook out of there. We don't want to just allow it to take back. So how can we make sure to keep this trade on favorable terms? Well, Austin does that with the move queen to d2. Now, if you want to get rid of the bishops and trade it off, my queen is going to dive into the attack with queen takes h6, and there's not a good way for black to prevent the bishops from coming off in a favorable way for white. So black plays a move queen to e7, hoping that, okay, this time if you take, I can retake with the queen instead of the rook, or maybe now if I take you on h6, I can play queen to f8 and kick your queen out with my queen. However, unfortunately, now white has tactical ways to win, and a few different ways at that. So, how does white take advantage here, and why is white's attack so strong? Well, first of all, let's look at all of the different things that are happening here. Obviously, there's tension between the two bishops on f8 and h6. At any point in time, white can play knight to d5, attacking the queen and the knight, so creating a little fork in the center. At any point in time, white can play f takes g6, capturing the pawn, threatening to capture another pawn with check, and opening up the f-file for the rook. This also opens up the diagonal for the light square bishop. So there's 3 different major threats in the air here. Lots of different motifs going on in white's position, and unfortunately for black, there's nothing active going on. Black is trying to defend all of these things, but the only tension black even has is on this h6 bishop. Other than that, nothing is being attacked. So, how does Austin go in for the kill here? Knight to d5 was the move played in the game. After knight to d5, well, black really has to do something here, and there's really only one move. If black chooses to retreat the queen, how can white take advantage of this situation? Well, there's a couple different options. One would be to pin the knight with a move like bishop to g5. Another option would be to just play f takes g5, opening up the rook onto the attack so that the knight can capture with check, and threatening to take another pawn with check along the way. So lots of different good moves for white in that scenario. So really black has to capture this knight. So knight takes knight. Okay, that was forced. What next? Well, of course, we're going to recapture the knight. C takes d5, and now, of course, black's other knight is under attack. And again, we start to see the problem of black just not having enough options. Where does this knight go? There's nowhere very useful for him. These 2 squares are covered, b4 and a5 by the queen. If the knight retreats to a7, it looks pretty silly. If the knight comes to d8, it's totally blocked in by white's pawn and black's own pawns. So the only real sensible looking square is to bring the knight to d4. And unfortunately, after knight to d4, well, things are falling apart a little bit too quickly. And why is that? Let's see how the sequence unfolds. Next move, knight takes d4, another forcing move. Notice how all of white's moves, black can do nothing but simply react. Not a lot of options for him. E takes d4, and now how can white shut the door on black's pieces and cause a quick resignation and finish to the game? Well, remember, where are the weak squares in black's camp? Black played g6 earlier, and now these dark squares have all become weak. How can we take advantage of that? f6. Shutting the door on the queen and gaining control over the g7 square so that now the queen is forced to leave the protection of this f8 bishop. So what happens after that? Queen to d8, and how does white finish off the game? Well, we want to envision where should our pieces go. What would be the dream scenario, right? Well, we've got this pawn on f6. The dream scenario would be to put the queen on g7, right? If we were playing Bug House and we were able to plop a queen down in there, we would do it right when we get the chance. And of course, we would have to trade this bishop first. So how can we force that in the game? Well, bishop takes f8, and now no matter what, the queen will come to h6 and g7 in the coming moves. So after rook to f8, queen to h6, black is busted. The only way to stop checkmate would be the move queen takes f6, and then you're just losing a full queen. This is just not any good. You drop the queen, and after black takes the bishop, you can take that back too. You're up a full queen. So in the game, after queen h6, black played bishop h3, being a good sport and just allowing the mate on the board. Of course, we all see this one. Final move of the game, white to move, mate in 1, queen to g7, checkmate. Very nice game played by Austin. A very good display of showing the plans of the Botvinnik system, shoving that f-pawn down the board, closing off the center, moving the pieces toward the king side, and making a very good display of attacking on the dark squares once black weakened the squares around his king. So very nice game, and I can't wait to see what else comes out of this classical chess here in Jacksonville. Make sure you keep sending those submissions in, and wishing you all best of luck. This is Nick Peterson signing off from the Jacksonville Chess for Charity Game of the Week. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like, post any comments, and share via the buttons below. Check out our website at chesswithnick.com for further video, more content, and any postings on lessons, further video analysis, or written analysis that you may be interested in. And be sure to check out our YouTube channel, Chess with Nick, on youtube.com. Have a great day, and wishing you best of luck.